In 1994, a teenage girl was savagely murdered in San Leandro on a cold, rainy night. Despite the investigators' best efforts, they could not find the person responsible. Time slowly passed, and the case went cold. It wasn't until 13 years later, after a near-fatal attack and a second murder, that we would find out who killed Evelyna LeBlanc. This case is a prime example of what stellar police work can do for a cold case and how a killer was taken off the streets. Evelyna LeBlanc grew up in the seaside town of San Leandro across the bay from San Francisco. She was incredibly close to her mother Arlene and was described as a bright, outgoing, loving and intelligent girl. Evelyna attended San Leandro High School and was a good student who knew how to make an impression on those around her. The day started out normal. Evelyna attended a football game with friends at Merritt College, but left early before getting onto a bus. She was dropped off at East 14th Street and 136th Avenue and was supposed to spend the night with a friend. The bus driver saw Evelyna talking to a young male who was never identified. This was the last time she was seen alive. It was 8:30 p.m. on the 5th of November 1994. A storm had blown into San Leandro with torrential rain. Patrol Officer Jim Stark was dispatched to an alarm from a local elementary school. Jim arrived at Jefferson Elementary and began walking around the property, ensuring everything was clear. The doors were locked and there was no apparent sign of anything amiss. He could have left then, but Officer Stark wanted to be thorough, so he continued to walk the rest of the school grounds. As he reached the end of the building, he saw something odd. An umbrella was laying upside down on the ground, gathering rain. He continued and saw something else, a pair of shoes and a jacket scattered on the ground. Officer Stark could also hear something, a faint, consistent banging noise. Cautiously, he peeked his head around the corner. There, laying against the wall, was a young girl. Her left hand was repeatedly banging the wall. It was clear she was in serious trouble. He didn't know it then, but Officer Stark had found 15-year-old Evelyna LeBlanc. He quickly called for an ambulance and for police backup before placing his raincoat over her body and holding her hand trying to comfort her. Paramedics were soon on the scene and the young woman was rushed to the emergency room. The investigators wouldn't wait until the morning. They knew they were racing against the clock to gather potentially crucial pieces of evidence before the rain destroyed them. While looking over the scene, a small black bag was found. Inside the bag was a student ID of Evelyna. Now that they knew who their victim was, they had to break the news to Evelyna's mother, Arlene. She was rushed to the hospital immediately but was greeted with devastating news when she arrived. Evelyna had been shot in the head and her prognosis was grim. Sergeant Autry James was the lead detective on the case. At the crime scene, a bullet casing was recovered near the umbrella. It appeared that Evelyna had been shot there and dragged a short distance towards the wall. Evelyna was placed on life support. Sadly, on the 6th of November, Evelyna passed away. The investigators were now dealing with a homicide case. Naturally, one of the first questions, aside from who was responsible, was why. Why had Evelyna been shot? Was it a jealous ex, or had she been in the wrong place at the wrong time? Initially, authorities were hoping that the DNA found on Evelyna would get a hit on the national database. Unfortunately, this wasn't the case. The investigators now set out to trace Evelyna's last moments, where she had been that day and who she had been with. After tracing her steps, they tracked down a bus driver with some useful information. Evelyna had been seen getting off a bus with a young man, whom the bus driver described as a teenage, light-skinned, slim African-American male with cornrows. 2 hours later, she was murdered. Unfortunately, efforts to track him down proved futile. The DNA sample was compared to multiple potential suspects in the area and people who knew Evelyna. Still, no matches were found. Investigators were exhausting all their options, and there was a real sense of frustration amongst them and Evelyna's mother. Unfortunately, with no new leads or information, the investigators were forced to move on to new cases they were handed. The months turned into years, and it was quickly 2006. Still, they seemed no closer to finding Evelyna's killer. That was until a seemingly unrelated crime occurred in Portland, Oregon. In March 2006, 35-year-old Evelyna Thompson was walking home after an evening of playing video poker. On her way back, a man appeared and walked over to her. He introduced himself, but she couldn't quite figure out his name. It sounded like Naji or Nani. He then asked Evelyna if she was from the islands. She told him she was not, and his attitude completely changed. Sensing he was getting angry, Evelyna changed her answer and said she was from the islands and told him that her earlier reply had just been a joke. The man then calmed down. This whole interaction made Evelyna very uncomfortable. She tried to distance herself from him, moving across the street and over the bridge. When she turned around, the man was no longer there. But the sense of unease deep inside her wasn't letting up. While she couldn't see the man, Evelyna felt she was being followed. Suddenly, he was alongside her again, this time on a blue bike. Evelyna turned to him and said, "You need to stop following me," and added that the police were following her since she had been in an altercation at a bar. This was a lie, but she hoped it would be enough to scare him off. However, his response was, "No, bitch, I'm following you." In a matter of seconds, the man was off his bike and attacked Evelyna. He pulled something from his pocket. It was a fisher knife. Evelyna was stabbed in the arms and the top of her head, while the man said his God had told him to do it. She felt warm blood pouring down her face and knew she was in serious trouble. The man wouldn't let up, but before he could go in for the fatal stab, a man appeared and his attack was interrupted. Evelyna's attacker jumped on his bike and rode off. When Evelyna arrived at the hospital, she was 5 minutes away from bleeding out. Police went to the scene hoping the attacker had left something behind. Thankfully, he had. In the altercation, his shoe had slipped off. It was sent off to the Oregon State Crime Lab. The chance of getting DNA profile from a shoe was slim, but there was still a chance. A partial profile was obtained, which was run against the existing database. No one could quite believe the results that came back. The DNA matched the profile found on Evelyna LeBlanc's body. San Leandro Sergeant Rick DeCosta, who worked on Evelyna's case, was contacted about the match. His first thought was to let Arlene know that they may be closer to solving Evelyna's case. Evelyna was also never far from Sergeant Autry's mind. He kept a photo of the young girl on his desk, and like everyone involved, was desperate for her killer to be brought to justice. Molly Dahl, a junior homicide detective with the Portland PD, was put on the case. She later admitted to feeling immense pressure as she had only been a homicide detective for around 6 months. Someone who had committed such violent crimes needed to be tracked down as soon as possible. It was highly likely that he would strike again. Detective Dahl set up a meeting with Evelyna, hoping she would gather more information from her. Evelyna described her attacker as an African-American male in his early 20s. He had a medium build, short hair, and dark eyes. Evelyna hadn't forgotten a thing about that night. She told Detective Dahl about the name she had heard, either Naji or Nani. Evelyna brought this up with her friends, who mentioned a man who spent most of his time downtown. He matched the description she gave and also went by the name Naji. Detective Dahl was thrilled with this information. Surely this was their man. When searching their systems and tracking recent prison records, she came back with a potential suspect. While his actual name was completely different, he went by the name Naji. The pieces seemed to fall into place until the DNA results came back as a negative match to the DNA from the attacks. Detective Dahl's next focus was going through recent arrest records from the area and compiling a list of men that matched the person she was looking for. The list was extensive, but she was confident the killer was one of the names in the pile. It was a rainy night in April 2007, eerily similar to when Evelyna was killed. A tow truck driver spotted a woman lying on the side of the road. He called 911, letting the operator know this was serious. There was blood everywhere. The woman needed help fast. Detective Lynn Courtney of the Portland Police was in charge of this case. The woman, who they later learned was Shavetta Brown, a mother of two, was still alive, but in critical condition. Not long after she arrived at the hospital, Shavetta died due to her injuries. She had suffered a vicious attack with severe trauma to the head. The coroner who performed the autopsy believed a hammer inflicted the damage. Due to the rain, crucial evidence was undoubtedly lost at the scene. Detective Courtney decided to look through the night's 911 calls. He spotted one that came in just minutes before Shavetta was found. Someone had called the police about a severe beating that was in progress. A woman screamed at the top of her lungs while a man attacked her. The caller also mentioned a white pickup truck with a white canopy. By the time police responded to the call, no one was around. Shavetta was discovered 8 blocks from where the attack took place. Detective Courtney focused on the pickup truck. His intuition told him it was likely a stolen vehicle, so he began paging through reports looking for a white pickup truck. None specified whether the car had a white canopy, but Detective Courtney hoped something else would catch his eye, which he did when he learned about a woman's stolen pickup truck that had been recovered. When the owner got it back, she noticed blood inside her vehicle. It seemed like someone had tried to wipe up blood using tissues, and when the blood was compared to Shavetta, it was a match. Shavetta had been in that truck. The owner also told Detective Courtney that a hammer was missing from the vehicle. A friend of Shavetta came forward to Detective Courtney with information that might help him find the killer. That night, she was in a pickup truck with Shavetta and an unknown African-American man. The caller remembered feeling uneasy, so she exited the vehicle and walked home. She told Detective Courtney that the man's name was something like Omani or Imani. Detective Courtney used this information and ran the names through a database, which could check phonetically similar names. This brought him 2 results, one of which was Imani Williams. It just so happened that Detective Dahl was working nearby and overheard Detective Courtney talking about the name with his partner. As she heard the name Imani, she remembered the name Nani that Evelyna had mentioned. Detective Dahl spoke to Detective Courtney and mentioned the possible connection. She then ran the name Imani Williams and checked his arrest records. Not only was it extensive, but Imani had also been arrested multiple times in the Bay Area in the 1990s. This meant he was around San Leandro when Evelyna was killed. It turned out he had lived in her neighborhood. The other thing that stood out to Detective Doyle was a felony charge on Imani's record. This meant his DNA should be on file. She contacted the crime lab and discovered that Imani Williams had a sample sitting at the lab that had not yet been analysed. This wasn't due to negligence on their part, but rather the sheer volume of samples they needed to analyse and log. Had Detective Doyle not called, it would have taken up to 2 years before he was on the system. While waiting for the DNA results, she assembled another photo lineup for Evelyna. Evelyna diligently went through each photo and immediately knew which one was her attacker. Evelyna was pointing to Imani Williams. 2 days after, Detective Doyle and Detective Courtney's cases were now linked. Detective Doyle received the call she had been waiting for. It was a match. Imani Williams was the man responsible for Evelyna's murder, Evelyna Thompson's attack, and Charvetta Brown's murder. He was soon arrested and charged. Detective Doyle was delighted to be able to call Sergeant Rick DeCosta and tell him the news. Sergeant DeCosta travelled to Portland with his partner to interview Imani, but he denied knowing Evelyna LeBlanc's name. Detectives took another DNA sample from Imani to cover their bases while he was in the interrogation room. It again came back as a match to all 3 crimes. In the end, Imani Williams pleaded guilty to murder and first-degree assault. He was given a life sentence with the possibility of parole after 30 years. Shockingly, Imani Williams was only 14 years old when he killed Evelyna. This meant he would not face prosecution for this crime since he was a juvenile when he committed the murder. Had he been convicted, Imani would have been held at the California Youth Facility until he was 25 years old. When they finally caught him, he was already 27 years old. While Arlene didn't feel Evelyna got justice, she did feel that a weight had been lifted from her shoulders, knowing that no one else would fall victim to this monster.